Well, good morning or good afternoon, everybody. I think we'll get our program started. My name is Thorin Tritter. I'm the Museum and Programming Director at the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center of Nassau County. I am delighted to welcome you to our Rwandan Genocide Commemoration Program. As many of you know, the Rwandan Genocide started 26 years ago this month on April 7th, 1994. As part of our mission to teach about the dangers of anti-Semitism, racism, bullying, and all manifestations of intolerance, we wanted to honor those killed in the Rwandan genocide and use this anniversary to give pause and to think about the lessons we, both individually and as a society, can take from the horrors that took place in Rwanda. Today, we are honored to have as our speaker Dr. Sara Brown, a historian and the executive director of New Jersey's Center for Holocaust, Human Rights, and Genocide Education, known as CHANGE. Dr. Brown holds the first PhD offered in comparative genocide studies, granted from Clark University's Strassler Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies. She has worked and conducted research in Rwanda since 2004 and is the author of Gender and the Genocide in Rwanda, Women as Perpetrators and Rescuers, that was published by Routledge in 2017. But Dr. Brown's experience is far broader than just an expertise on the Rwandan genocide. She's also served as a project coordinator in refugee camps in Tanzania, worked in refugee resettlement in Texas, and researched conflict globalization in Israel. And prior to taking the helm at CHANGE, she was the person responsible for developing and managing post-secondary educational program for the USC Shoah Foundation. Today, she is going to speak about how and why the genocide occurred in Rwanda, the impact of the genocide on the people and the country, and Rwanda's post-genocide reconstruction and rehabilitation efforts. So with that introduction, welcome, Sara, and thanks very much for doing this.
Thank you, Thorin. Thank you so much for having me. And thank you to everyone who's joining us today for our Kwibuka26 commemorative program. The weather is something else, and so I hope all of you are doing well and safe in your homes. Also, given the global pandemic that we're experiencing, I hope everyone is well and healthy and safe. My name is Sara Brown, and yes, I am the proud executive director at CHANGE, the Center for Holocaust, Human Rights, and Genocide Education in Lincroft, New Jersey. Thank you, Thorin, for putting this together, and to the staff at the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center of Nassau County. I'm thrilled that we're having this opportunity to collaborate and hope that it's the start of a very warm friendship and relationship. So today, as Thorin mentioned, I'm going to speak to you about the 1994 genocide in Rwanda. I'm going to share with you a little bit about the history of Rwanda, how the genocide occurred, and the details of the genocide itself, as well as Rwanda's long road to rehabilitation and reconstruction. So first things first. Let's see if I can, there we go. Let's talk a little bit about the country of Rwanda. Rwanda is that tiny, tiny little blurb. It's that little green dot in the middle of Central Africa on your screen. It is a tiny landlocked country. It's approximately 10,000 square miles in size, which makes it roughly the size of the state of Maryland here in the United States. It shares borders with Uganda to the north, Burundi to its south, Tanzania to its, I'm now like doing this in reverse, over to its east, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo to its west. Rwanda is comprised of three distinct groups, the Tutsi, the Hutu, and the Twa. And those groups, up until the pre-colonial days, this is before the arrival of colonizing Europeans, first the Germans and then the Belgians, we'll get to that in a moment. They lived side by side in relative peace. These three groups all spoke the same language, Kinyarwanda, which basically means the language of Rwanda, and they shared similar cultural and religious practices. Intermarriage was very common, and their designation as Hutu, Tutsi, or Twa was not necessarily an ethnic class. It was socioeconomic. It was determined by wealth and by stature, proximity to power, and in part, it was based on ownership of cattle. Now, Rwanda is known as the land of 1,000 hills, and that is not an exaggeration. It is a lush, green, beautiful country. There are volcanoes in the north and numerous lakes throughout the country, but it does not benefit from the same mineral wealth as its neighbors in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Before the genocide, its primary exports were coffee and tea, and those are not considered very strategic or important in terms of geopolitical realities. The other thing to note is that it's a primarily agricultural society, and this is a challenge. The majority of Rwandans are relying on farming or cattle to survive. And I just noted this is a very small country. It's actually quite densely populated. There are estimates that approximately 7 million people lived in Rwanda at the time of the genocide. And so all of this makes it a region that is a bit ripe for conflict. Now, a little bit about the history of Rwanda. Genocide does not occur in a vacuum. And in order to fully understand what took place in 1994, and this is the inner historian in me, I think we first need to understand a bit more about Rwanda's origins, colonial history, and episodes of violence and upheaval in the early, first colonial, but then early independence and post-colonial period. So briefly, I want to cover some of the necessary aspects of Rwanda's history. So first things first, when the colonialists arrived in the late 1800s, they found a highly organized kingdom in Rwanda. There was a rich culture, thriving indigenous religious practices, traditions that were carried forward by word of mouth. They were passed down from generation to generation through music, dance, poetry, story, the recitations. At the time, Rwanda was a highly organized Tutsi-led monarchy with defined borders. It was a kingdom. Class distinctions were increasingly significant, though, and the Tutsi ruling class was the favored ruling class. And the Hutus, the majority of the population, they were limited in their capacity, but they were able to carry out some court rituals. And identities at the time are somewhat fluid, or they were at the time. For example, a Hutu who acquired enough wealth and with it power could transform into a Tutsi, and a Tutsi that fell out of favor lost their wealth, lost their access to the power and the proximity to the court. They could transfer to Hutu status. Now, the arrival of colonialism changed Rwanda. One of the cartoons that you see on the screen is from the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885. And there you have 14 European countries that came together and divided up the country of Africa with no thought to its existing kingdoms, no thought to the existing cultures, no thought to the people already inhabiting this very diverse, rich continent. Rwanda went to the Germans, who, upon arrival in Rwanda, immediately encountered the highly organized kingdom in place and identified the then king. His term was Mwami. Mwami means king, basically, in Rwanda. Mwami Musinga, who was in power at the time, and the Tutsi minority. The German colonialists identified them as an elite class and treated them as such over the majority Hutu. In an effort to exert control, they then favored and manipulated the groups that were in Rwanda. So the Hutus and the Tutsis at the time are really the key players. And I should note, around 1990, there was a very problematic, highly politicized survey, but that survey is the only statistics we have about who comprised what group in Rwanda at the time. And it was roughly 14% Tutsi, 84 or 85% Hutu, and then a very minute population, about a percent and a half, were the Twa. So at the same time that the German colonialists arrive in Rwanda, the White Fathers, which is a European missionary order of priests, they also arrive in Rwanda, and they work in tandem with the German colonialists and start trying to convert Rwandans to Catholicism, largely through education and social programs. Now, the Mwami, the king, initially prohibited these missionaries from instructing the Tutsi in Rwanda. And as a result, the White Fathers worked primarily with the Hutus and began to forge very strong bonds with that population. This further heightened later ethnic tensions between the Hutu and the Tutsi in Rwanda. Now, Germany lost all of, oh, and I should also note the photograph that you see here is actually the king, Mwami Musinga, with several of his wives, and also his the king's mother, who was a very high power figure in Rwandan history. Now, Germany lost all of its colonies after it was defeated in World War I, and Belgium was the country that assumed control of Rwanda. They, at the time, were also in charge of the Democratic Republic of the Congo and Burundi. So they treated the three as one conglomerate whole, which only contributed further to the disaster that they left in their wake. Belgian colonialists further institutionalized this idea of a Hutu-Tutsi distinction that had previously been exploited by the Germans. This period of time, now I'm talking about the 1920s, the 1930s, it coincided with the popularity of this pseudoscience, this belief around racial superiority, eugenics, racial difference, and the search for the most superior racial class. And for those of you who have studied the Holocaust, this may sound familiar. This is definitely in line with that search for the perfect Aryan class, which the Nazi Germany undertook. Believing that Tutsis' physical appearance resembled that of Europeans, the Belgian colonialists very foolishly and mistakenly decided that the Tutsis were racially superior to the Hutu and Twa, and they began treating them as such. Now, in 1933-1934, the Belgian colonial government went even further, and they introduced identity cards they were still in use in 1994 Rwanda, and further assisted the genocidaires, the perpetrators of the genocide in Rwanda, in identifying and murdering Tutsis. These identity cards were used from 34 onward and were at the time used to favor the Tutsi minority class. They also established an inflexible racial concept of what it meant to be Hutu, Tutsi, or Twa. It became a racial classification, an ethnic classification. And that had not previously been the case. From then on, ethnicity was also considered unchangeable. And it was something that was determined at birth and patrilineal. So it went from father to child, and it could not be changed. This is all new, and it was an arbitrary decision made by Belgian colonial government back in the 1930s. Now, during this time, the Tutsis enjoyed a privileged, albeit still very tenuous and highly discriminatory. I have to say, I mean, they were privileged under the Belgian colonial masters, but the Belgians were still colonial masters. And the king clashed with the Belgian colonial government repeatedly. Eventually, they even had Musinga ousted in favor of his son, Wami Rudahigwa. And Rudahigwa, he converted to Christianity and was considered much more pliable and favored by the Belgian colonial government. Now, post-World War I, there was this transition from the German to the Belgian colonial governments. Post-World War II, many colonized countries pushed for independence from colonial rule completely. And in the 1950s, Hutus and Tutsis alike called for Rwanda's independence from Belgium. They were not united in their efforts, unfortunately, and this meant that many Hutus demanded that the Tutsi minority be stripped of power and that it be majority rule. Some Tutsis demanded a return to monarchical rule and a return to the king's prominence, and still others wanted full democracy. Now, it was during this time that 9 Hutu intellectuals, including one who would become the future president of Rwanda, Gregor Kayibanda, they published what became known as the Hutu Manifesto. And this was published with input from the white fathers, and it asserted that the Hutu majority should be the ones to rule Rwanda. Around the same time, Belgium abandoned their Tutsi allies and joined with the Catholic Church to align with the Hutu majority, and violence and unrest followed. This period became known as the Hutu Revolution. And rather than unite against the colonial power, Hutus and Tutsis instead fought each other, and the Belgians stood by as many Tutsis were murdered or forced to flee. These tensions heightened in 1962 when Rwanda became an independent country. Elections ushered in a majority Hutu ruling party, and Rwanda's first president, as I mentioned before, his name was Gregor Kayibanda, and he actually ended up ruling until a coup d'etat, bloodless coup, in 1973. Now, this initial independence period, despite the shared language, despite the shared culture, despite the shared traditions, saw this tremendous upheaval and violence as Hutus targeted Tutsis around the country. Tens of thousands of Tutsis were murdered, and hundreds of thousands fled to neighboring countries. By the late 1980s, nearly 500,000 Rwandans lived as refugees in Uganda, then Zaire, now was known as the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Burundi, and Tanzania. Now we're going to jump ahead a couple of decades to 1990. By 1990, Rwanda has been ruled by two different men, Kayibanda and the current president in 1990, whose name is, he's really, let's be honest, a dictator. His name is Juvenal Habyarimana, who's been in charge since 1973. There's single party rule. There's only one party that you can be a part of, and dissent is punished very violently. It's a difficult time to live in Rwanda. And in 1990, an exiled Tutsi group who had formed a rebel group known as the Rwandan Patriotic Front, they invaded Rwanda from its northern border. They invaded from Uganda and started pushing south. Now, the RPF demanded the right to return home and a role in the then single-party, non-democratic Rwandan government. They advanced very quickly. The RPF really, they were making their way towards the capital city of Kigali quite quickly, and President Habyarimana reached out to his allies, the French, and asked them to intervene militarily. Now, the French at the time were allied with Rwanda because they saw it as a francophone ally, a French-speaking ally in a region that was dominated by Anglophone countries. And they sent French forces who helped to drive back the RPF fighters. Now, this post-invasion, post-October 1990 invasion period marks a strong uptick in anti-Tutsi discrimination and Hutu extremism. It had been there since the 1960s. There had been episodes of violence, though not too widespread and not too violent. But in the 1990s, we really see an uptick in discrimination, extremism, and violence. And the seeds of the genocide really take root during this period. Rwanda's national army begins recruiting and training young Hutu men under the pretense of creating these defense leagues in order to protect neighborhoods and track down Tutsi infiltrators. These men, many of whom were actually trained with the assistance of the French military, there's photographs of this where they're marching alongside French forces. They later became the core of the killing militias known as the Interahamwe during the genocide. Now, during this period, a UN peacekeeping force is established and deployed to Rwanda, and they are tasked with monitoring a peace agreement that had been brokered by the UN between the Rwandan Patriotic Forces, so those Tutsi rebels that had invaded from Uganda, and Habyarimana's government. That treaty went into effect in 1993, and the UN force commander, then Lieutenant General Romeo Dallaire, later plays a key role during the genocide in trying to protect some who were targeted by the genocide, but also by and large standing by as many were murdered. This period also sees a proliferation in Hutu extremist propaganda. Print media like Kangura, which was a mouthpiece for the extremist Hutus, manipulated headlines and included graphic cartoons that would disseminate lies about the Tutsis and whip up fear and anger. They were the ones that published the cartoon that you can see on your screen, which depicts Lieutenant General Romeo Dallaire being seduced by two Tutsi women with a Belgian UN peacekeeping force standing guard as he is seduced and manipulated. And the translated headline, the tag that you see there, it's actually written in Kinyarwanda, but the translation into English is General Dallaire and his army have fallen into the trap of Tutsi femme fatales. So they would regularly publish cartoons like this. They also famously published the Hutu 10 Commandments, which pitted Hutu against Tutsi using religious rhetoric in a country that was over 90% Christian. Now, with at least 66% of Rwandans being literate in 1994, Kangura definitely fueled genocidal fear and mobilized people to participate in the genocide. But the radio also played a key role, and the state-sponsored radio, it was the RTLM, Radio Télévision Libre de Mille Collines. RTLM regularly would broadcast anti-Tutsi hate messages in its news reports, its daily programs, and also in its music. Now, RTLM had a widespread audience, and for the population that was not literate, they had access to a radio. Most people did. And the RTLM would often even read out what had been published in Kangura in order to further whip up and spread these genocidal messages throughout the country. Now, it should be noted that these media outlets targeted women in particular, Tutsi women in particular. And in Rwandan culture, women's modesty and chastity at the time were highly prized. So when the extremist media would specifically target and demonize Tutsi females, they often would hypersexualize them and depict them as these ethnic others and inhuman deviants. And this certainly contributed to the highly sexualized and violent targeting of Tutsi women during the genocide. Now, the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda began on the evening of April 6th with the assassination of Juvenal Habyarimana. He was, again, the dictator, the president in charge of Rwanda at that time. His plane was shot out of the sky on approach to Kigali International Airport, and everyone on board was murdered. Almost immediately, the killing of Tutsi and moderate Hutus began. The RTLM, those extremist radio announcers, blamed Habyarimana's assassination on the Rwandan Patriotic Front, and they broadcasted a hate propaganda to incite the genocide against the Tutsi. At the same time, the Rwandan armed forces, the government forces known as the FAR, and the Interahamwe militia, the killing militias, began to set up roadblocks throughout the capital city of Rwanda. And they were distributing lists of influential Rwandans, many prominent Tutsis, but also moderate Hutus who would not go along with this program of genocide. They distributed lists with their names and their addresses so that people would be able to go out and target them for murder. So by April 7th, which is the official date of commemoration in Rwanda, Rwandans living in Kigali, the capital city, woke up to these roadblocks that were being staffed now by the military and the killing militias. They woke up to these lists of influential Rwandans marked for murder that had been distributed around the city and were also being read out loud on the radios, and they woke up to killings taking place across the city. Now, the international community was quickly aware of the spreading violence in Rwanda, and they took immediate action, not to stop the genocide, but to protect expatriates who were living and working in Rwanda. So countries like the United States, France, and Belgium sent armed units to oversee the evacuation of their people. By April 15th, so now just a week later, foreign nationals had evacuated the country via military escort, and they were now back in their respective home countries. Rwandan staff, though, and Rwandan friends, Rwandan neighbors were all left behind and left to be slaughtered. Now, shortly after the murder of 10 UN Belgian peacekeepers by Rwandan armed forces, and despite Lieutenant General Dallaire's strong protest, the UN at the same time officially cut its forces, the UN peacekeeping forces that were in Rwanda, from a very thin force. They only had about 2,548 armed individuals or peacekeepers that were in Rwanda. They cut that force down to 270. The genocide spread throughout the country in the ensuing 100 days. The genocidaires, the perpetrators of the genocide, slaughtered more than 900,000 men, women, and children. Again, in just 100 days. This is considered the fastest genocide in modern history. The victims, majority Tutsis, but also some Hutu moderates, were systematically hunted, tortured, raped, and murdered as part of an orchestrated genocide. Often, neighbors murdered neighbors using machetes or clubs, traditional farming tools in Rwanda. Hutu extremists, they attempted to annihilate the entire Tutsi population of Rwanda. And thousands of Tutsi women were also targeted during this period. They were raped or taken as sex slaves. In addition, the genocidaires, the genocide perpetrators, used something called scorched earth practices. This meant that when they came into an area, they did not just murder the people, they also destroyed all livestock. They decimated buildings and infrastructure. They burned crops throughout the country. And this also contributed to the utter destruction of Rwanda and prevented it from being able to rebuild immediately after the violence. So maybe the people could have taken refuge after a wave of militia came through their village and destroyed the village, but they made such concerted efforts to decimate everything in their path that even those who were able to survive the initial wave of killings struggled to survive without homes to live in, without livestock, without crops to farm in order to survive. Now, as the violence spread, people fled their homes in search of safe haven. And during previous bouts of violence in Rwanda, churches had often proved neutral territory, a safe space for Hutu and Tutsi alike who wanted to flee the violence. This time, however, there was no place to go. Many of the genocidaires gathered at these traditional sites of refuge, churches, large schools, also some hospitals, and targeted them for attack. So here in the photos that I have listed, you actually will see that two of these photos I took myself. The one where the Virgin Mary is standing over, or a statue of the Virgin Mary is standing over clothing. It's clothing that of the people who had been murdered. This was a photograph that I took in Nyamata Church, which is a site of over 10,000 people were slaughtered there. It was a Catholic church compound where Hutu and Tutsi alike went to in search of refuge. And when the Interahamwe killing militias and the armed forces came, they separated the Hutus out from the Tutsis, kept the Tutsis in the compound, and then systematically attacked the church over a period of several days and murdered just about everyone inside. Another image that you can see with the small cement benches was actually a Sunday school at a nearby church in Nitarama. And there they had hidden the children. And unfortunately, the genocidaires did not spare the children and they murdered them in that Sunday school. At the same time that these churches, schools, and some hospitals were targeted, roadblocks were set up not just in the capital city of Kigali, but throughout the country. And the Interahamwe militia and some of their civilian supporters would check those identity cards. Remember the identity cards that were established back in 1933-34? They would check those identity cards and murder anyone who was suspected of being a Tutsi. For example, very quickly people realized that the identity cards, which included your ethnic identity on them, were a death sentence. And so they discarded their identity cards. And then the genocidaires would rely on, did they know the person? Did they recognize them? Or did they appear Tutsi, looking at common tropes and stereotypes about the physical appearance of a Tutsi versus a Hutu? At this time, the roadways were littered with bodies. Other killers moved from house to house and searched the fields, the forests, and the swamps, wiping out entire families. Most of these killings were intensely personal. Again, it was often people who knew one another that were perpetrating the killings. But in some instances, neighbors hesitated to murder their friends and their people who had joined them in their marketplace, in their church, in their schools. In those instances, the Rwandan armed forces and the Interahamwe militias would bring in strangers to conduct the killings. Now, the international community completely failed Rwanda during the genocide. The French government, an ally of Habyarimana, and later the government that ruled after he was murdered, they provided cover for the Hutu extremists during and after the genocide. Many wanted perpetrators of the genocide, suspected perpetrators of the genocide, still live in France to this day. Belgium, the former colonial power that had done so much damage from World War II until the independence period, they were the first to remove their peacekeepers from the UN peacekeeping forces. And the United States rejected pleas to military, there were pleas and lobbying and efforts begging them to intervene militarily or even just to jam the radio signal, which the United States refused to do. And the United States also lobbied for a reduced peacekeeping force even as the genocide escalated. Days later, on April 21st, 1994, despite overwhelming evidence, by the way, that the genocide was underway, and as a result of lobbying from countries like the United States, France, Belgium, and others, that is when the UN Security Council voted to drastically reduce the UN peacekeeping forces in Rwanda. And so this is just 2 weeks after the genocide has begun, and it is now well underway. It is a week after all the expatriate forces, the expatriate civilians had left the country. And even then, they pushed to reduce the peacekeeping forces and limit the possibility of rescuing or even rescuing targeted individuals or stopping the genocide completely. As a result, despite the presence of UN peacekeeping forces and knowledge that the genocide was being perpetrated, it was known around the world, the genocide continued unabated. The genocide ended only after the Tutsi-led rebel forces, the Rwandan Patriotic Front, which happened to be a highly trained force, they took control of Rwanda in July of 1994, and they were the ones who stopped the genocide. And from then on, Rwandans began a lengthy and difficult reconstruction and rehabilitation process that continues even today. Now, all of this, the entire genocide, it lasted just 100 days, but the devastation continues to impact Rwanda even today. Now, the genocide technically ended after the RPF captured the Kigali, the capital city, and the Hutu extremists and genocidaires fled the country, many to neighboring Democratic Republic of the Congo, Zaire, again to its west. But the violence continued in some areas well after what they call Kwibuka. Kwibuka is Independence Day in Rwanda. They actually share the same day as the United States. July 4th is Independence Day there, but the violence actually continued in some areas well after that. The RPF declared a unilateral ceasefire, and they quickly set about establishing a national unity government, a power-sharing government that was based on the previously agreed to 1993 Arusha Accords, that peace treaty that the UN forces had come in to monitor. Now, the RPF militia converted into a national army, and they began patrolling the country in an effort to enforce the peace. Now, here I need to note that post-genocide Rwanda is unlike other post-genocide narratives of the 20th century. The survivors did not relocate to another country and build their lives anew. The majority stayed in Rwanda, and today perpetrators and survivors live side by side. This is unusual, and the how of it requires some considerable discussion and thinking. Now, Rwanda, the country and the people, were utterly devastated after the genocide. Again, it was labeled the fastest genocide in modern history, and the loss of life was compounded by the flight of another 2 million people, those Hutu extremists and some civilians, and many perpetrators who fled the country. So in a matter of 100 days, over 40% of Rwanda's population is gone. Up to 150,000 children were orphaned and vulnerable, and somewhere between 250,000 and 500,000 women had been raped. These are survivors who had been raped, many deliberately infected with HIV/AIDS. And at the same time, because of those scorched earth policies I described before, the country's infrastructure has been devastated. So much so that the USIP report back in 1995, they had a report at a conference that they published. It said the following: the capital city, Kigali, is left in ruin. Of the 350,000 inhabitants before the war, only 40 to 50,000 remain. There is no running water, no electricity, no government infrastructure, and nearly every building is damaged. So how does one rebuild in that context? I actually asked that question to a woman named Rose Kabuye, who was a major in the RPF during the genocide, before and during the genocide, and was appointed the mayor of Kigali immediately after the genocide. She was the one who was charged with rebuilding the capital city despite the absence of a municipal budget. And she laughed at me when I asked her this question. She told me I had no choice. Within the first year, and without any money for salaries, Kabuye put people to work cleaning the city, repairing the infrastructure, and maintaining security. And the way she did that was she relied on assistance from outside. From the World Food Program, for example. They had a food for work initiative, and she was able to offer many workers food instead of a salary. And given how destitute and destroyed the country was, many agreed to this program. Every Wednesday, Kabuye would hold town hall meetings with the residents of Kigali, and she would come in person and assign the issues that were being raised by the citizens to members of her staff immediately on site in real time for follow-up. Now, I asked her if she actually faced discrimination or resistance as a result of being a woman leader during this time. Rwanda was a very highly patriarchal society before the genocide, and after the genocide, there tremendous gains have been made in gender mainstreaming and women's rights. But I wondered, this is immediately after if anybody, resisted her leadership. And she began to laugh. She told me, I was a major. I was from the RPF. I think everybody knew that we were not coming around to joke. They knew we were coming to work. Now, when Kabuye left the mayor's office to serve as a member of parliament, Kigali was transformed. It was a city with a growing economy, a strong security apparatus, functioning roads, a rising skyline, and a sense of hope for the future. Around the country, this was the case. Post-genocide, survivors and perpetrators in Rwanda slowly returned to daily life, often faced with the unimaginable task of living side by side again as neighbors. Many Tutsi refugees who were living outside of Rwanda returned to the country. Others sought new lives elsewhere. And most of the Hutus who had fled in the immediate aftermath of the genocide, they did not return to Rwanda for several years. It was only in 1998 when the majority of them returned, and that was when refugee camps in the Democratic Republic of the Congo were forcibly closed. Now, during this period, justice was a priority. 6 months after the genocide, the United Nations Security Council instituted the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, the ICTR, in order to try the top-tier criminals who were suspected and accused of perpetrating the genocide in Rwanda. They operated for just about 20 years, a little shy of 20 years. They spent over $1 billion, and unfortunately, they indicted just 93 suspects and sentenced just 62. By 2003, in Rwanda, more than 100,000 suspected genocidaires awaited trial, often in makeshift prisons, and they were suffering in inhumane conditions. It was estimated that it would take the national courts over a century to try everyone suspected of participating in the genocide. And so as a result, Rwanda set about establishing a hybrid court known as Gacaca in communities throughout Rwanda in order to expedite the judicial process. And here you can actually see an image of one of the Gacaca courts at work, with the man standing in the center of an audience that is seated on the grass and bearing witness as he gives his testimony to the Inyangamugayo, or the elected judges who oversaw the process. Now, in the end, Gacaca was started, the pilot program began in 2004, it went nationwide in 2006, and it closed officially in 2012. So it operated nationwide for just 6 years. There were over 10,000 courts, and over 260,000 Inyangamugayo, or judges, were elected and trained and oversaw cases during this time. With those numbers, 6 years, 260,000 in Inyangamugayo, 10,000 courts, they were able to try nearly 2 million cases of genocide and 1,003,227 individuals suspected of perpetrating the genocide. There was a new constitution that was instituted around this time in 2003, and it did away with many of the ethnic and gender-based discriminatory practices. And then in 2008, Rwanda became the first country in the world to elect a women's majority parliament. It was Rwanda that did that, not the Scandinavian countries, as most of my students like to guess when I ask this question in class. Rwanda achieved the same feat again in 2013, and one member of parliament, a woman, actually joked to me after this election that the men don't need to worry, the government will ensure that they are not marginalized. Now, Rwanda continues to rebuild, not just the country and the people, but also its identity. And the government abolished the identity cards that listed ethnicity and banned all reference to ethnic terms in political discussions in an effort to rebuild the ethos and national identity of the people, as well as their individual identity. More recently, Rwanda embarked on something called the Ndi Munyarwanda, I Am Rwandan campaign. I think that began in 2012, which has helped to build a national identity and foster unity. They also host annual commemorations known as Kwibuka. Kwibuka is the Kinyarwanda word for to remember, meaning to remember. And Kwibuka takes place every year throughout the country, throughout the period of the 100 days. But the official commemoration day starts on April 7th. The first week is really when, at a national level, many programs take place. And then more local programs occur around the country over the next 100 days. The impact of the genocide in Rwanda continues to endure. As of 2016, over 60% of Rwanda's population was estimated to be under the age of 25. Now, that means that there is this incredibly young population that is just coming into their their age of leadership and adulthood, where they will be taking the reins in the country. And they're the reason that I remain so hopeful for Rwanda's future. Now, my first trip to Rwanda it coincided with the 10th commemoration in 2004. I was there again many times throughout the years, and then again for Kwibuka26 in 2014. And I was thinking about it this year, actually, as we are self-isolating and social distancing. And I've been watching Rwandans all around Rwanda, but also in the United States and around the world. They've been gathering virtually now to remember, to unite, and to renew. And I've been watching more and more as the young leaders of the country, that population of 25 and under that have really grown up in the legacy of the genocide, child survivors as well, who are now in their late 20s, 30s. I'm watching all of them really take the lead as they commemorate, as they reflect, as they unite and commit themselves to continuing to renew Rwanda. This next generation is the reason that I have so much hope for Rwanda, that they will continue to rebuild, that they will continue to thrive, and that they will further ensure that when Rwandans say never again, it is not one of these oft-cited adages, but is in fact their reality. I want to thank everyone for listening to my talk today, and I'll invite you to come and visit us at our center. We have a permanent exhibit there called Journeys Beyond Genocide, the Human Experience. Much of what I've shared with you today, including content and images, is included in that exhibit. And thank you again for your time. And now, if we have time, Thorin, I'm happy to open it up for questions.
Thank you very much, Sarah. On behalf of the audience, I will offer my applause, which is not easy to convey on our small screens and such, but thank you very much. I think you may be able to see already one question that Elise has posed. She says, do you have statistics about women in government, military, running businesses, and what's the status of women who were raped? Was there an impact on the family system? Any statistics on divorce? So maybe we'll start there, although I think other questions might come up too.
Yeah, Elise, those are great questions. I don't have any very current stats, but I can offer some information. So first, it's so interesting to note that 1994 Rwanda is a tough place to be a woman. Women couldn't open a bank account without the signature of a husband. They could not inherit property, and they represented less than 5% of the elected officials in elected positions in government. So it is a highly patriarchal society at the time, and women are second-class citizens effectively. In the aftermath of the genocide, many women had been given leadership roles in the RPF when they were in the refugee camps in Uganda and in the diaspora. And when they came back to Rwanda to now take leadership roles in the Rwandan unity government, they really pushed this idea that there needed to be reform. And so they changed the 1992 family law that officially recognized men as the head of the household. They changed inheritance laws. They changed banking laws. They instituted all of these measures to ensure that women could play an active role in helping to rebuild the country. And they made a very legitimate argument. They said, look, most of the people who fled the country were men, and many men were targeted during the genocide. And at this point, women make up between 60 and 70% of the population. If you want this country to rebuild, you're going to have to empower them and give them the ability to rebuild it. And they were very effective in making those cases. And so women were able to take key roles both in the government, and now we see that with 2008 and 2013, they are the majority members of parliament, and the Speaker of the House is a woman. In the 2003 Constitution, they also guaranteed that at least 30% of all appointed positions, so these are heads of different ministries in the Senate, that those would all be taken by women. And I think it's actually closer to 50%. It might actually be more than 50% at this point in terms of the appointed positions. All these different measures were put in place, and women really took the role in mentoring and building up a new generation of women to also lead. And so there are a lot of incredible gender mainstreaming achievements that have occurred in Rwanda. The family system certainly changed dramatically. I would say that it's an interesting reality, and it reminds me a little bit of some of the issues I see amongst women here in the United States. that some women are now talking about the fact that it feels like they're overworked because they have the full-time job, which is their professional careers, and then they also have the full-time job of managing much of the household responsibilities. And so I think there needs to be a little bit more gender equity that now happens in the distribution of work in the private sphere and the domestic sphere. But that's a transition that many of us are struggling with around the world. Okay, I see another question from Aaron. Should I just go ahead, Thorne, and answer the questions on the chat?
Yeah, that's great. If you wouldn't mind just reading it so that if we project this or show it when it's recorded, we can have those questions too, that would be helpful.
Great, good point. Okay, so for this question, would you please suggest some individuals that you would focus on if you taught in a high school setting? Paul Rusesabagina comes to mind, but I would like to include others. Okay. I really like featuring stories of both rescuers and child survivors when I'm working with a younger audience. I think the child survivors are able to place themselves in that child mentality and reach youth in a way that someone who survived at the age of 30, they can't really place themselves in the same way. I like working with some of the survivors that we have in our area. One whom I would strongly recommend is a wonderful speaker for both upper middle school and high school audience is a young man named Yannick Tona, who is a child survivor. There are also some resources and books that are available. We have some free resources on our website, including, I'm trying to think, what is the name of the book? It'll come to me and I'll come back to you about that. One thing I would note is that Paul Rusesabagina is somewhat of a controversial figure in Rwanda. He's the man who is credited with helping to protect Tutsis who were hiding at the Hotel de Mille Collines. He lives here in the United States, and he did the movie Hotel Rwanda was based on his depiction of his actions in Rwanda. It's a little bit more problematic than that because actually the UN peacekeeping forces were the ones that sent a contingent to protect that hotel. And Paul Rusesabagina has been accused by survivors of extorting considerable sums of money from them, and when they were unable to pay, handing over people to be murdered by the Interahamwe. And so Hotel Rwanda and the idea of his acts of rescue is it's a good story to tell, but there is some nuance there that is a little problematic, especially when you think about the role that he played taking money. When we think about the righteous among the Gentiles, which is a program to honor the rescuers from the Holocaust, one of the requirements to be one of the righteous is that you could not take monetary payment in exchange for protecting or rescuing. And so he does not fit that category. And in fact, he may have punished those who could not pay. Other great free resources out there, the Kigali Genocide Memorial actually has an array of testimonies that they've gathered that are available on their genocide archives. USC Shoah Foundation, they have a free online website called Eyewitness where they have testimonies, but also activities and educational programs for the K through 12, really 5th grade through 12th grade audience. And then there are some for post-secondary that I designed there. So I'm happy to, Aaron, connect with you offline and send you more resources. And then Helen asked the United States, what was the United States justification for a lack of intervention, particularly regarding the radio signal disruptions? Okay, so the United States, it's a complicated story. The reason that they refused to jam the radio signal was that they did a cost analysis and determined that it would be too expensive, unfortunately. But I also want to flag that this was in the aftermath of the Mogadishu incident that had happened. So for those of you who aren't familiar, there is a film out there called Black Hawk Down, which is a Hollywood depiction of an incident that took place in 1993, where the United States sent in forces, this is post-Cold War, the United States sent in forces to protect humanitarian aid supplies that were being delivered to Somalians who were living the state was broken at the time, there were warlords, and they were starving. And so the United States sent in armed forces, and eventually they decided to take a more active role, and that they would start pursuing some of the warlords for human rights atrocities and violence that they were perpetrating. And in response, one particular warlord coordinated an attack against US armed forces, and Americans woke up one Sunday morning to find American soldiers, their bodies were being dragged through the streets of Mogadishu, the capital of Somalia. And it was a very violent and traumatizing experience. And the argument is that the United States and the president at the time, Bill Clinton, did not want another Mogadishu on his hands. He did not want another Black Hawk Down incident. And so when the genocide began in Rwanda, the extremists were very deliberate in targeting 10 Belgian peacekeepers. They kidnapped them, they very violently murdered them, and then they desecrated their bodies and left them in a heap. And then called General Dallaire, called the UN peacekeeping headquarters, and invited them to come and pick up the bodies. And when they came there, it was so deeply traumatizing for the Belgians first, but then all the other international contributors to peacekeeping forces. The UN was not, I mean, the United States was not one of them, but they, of course, heard the story of what had happened, that they voted to reduce the size of the peacekeeping forces, and the United States decided not to put, quote unquote, boots on the ground. Can we get a list of resources to find testimony and classroom materials and activities? Yes, and Thorin, I'll happily send you a list, because of course, as I'm thinking on the fly, I'm forgetting all of the names of the great resources, but I promise you I will send you happily a list. We have there is such a wealth of information that's out there, and a lot of time has been put into, and effort has been put into developing resources for educators, which I think is phenomenal, and especially in this day and age where so many of us need online teaching resources, I will happily help you build out that list.
Thanks very much, Sarah.
Any
This
other
has been
questions?
super, and I'm very grateful for your participation, and look forward to other ways that the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center of Nassau County can collaborate with the Center for Holocaust, Human Rights, and Genocide Education in New Jersey. We are sister organizations, and we look forward to partnering together in the future.
Oh, it'd be my pleasure. Thank you so much for giving us this opportunity, and thank you to everyone who's part of the program. I know power outages are an issue right now, so thank you for being here.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Sarah, and thanks to all our participants. And I look forward to seeing others of you at our programs coming up. On Wednesday, we have an upcoming Curator's Corner about some currency from the Weimar era that's in our exhibition. And on Thursday, we have a program about the history of the bagel and the bialy to celebrate the end of Passover. And finally, our Yom HaShoah program coming up on Sunday the 19th at 1 o'clock. Okay, thanks everybody, and enjoy the rest of your day.